And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather showing a frontal system here over the eastern Bering Sea, bringing rain from the eastern Aleutians all the way up to the western Arctic coast there. Dry over the interior, and a big storm coming northward here, bringing gale force winds and rain into Kodiak Island up along the North Gulf Coast, and a little bit of light rain into portions of the southeast coast. And tomorrow, Northern Panhandle sees the best chance of rain and gale force winds and rain heavy at times here from about Cordova on over to Seward down to Kodiak Island, and stays wet here over the eastern Bering Sea into areas of the western interior, but dry over the Alaska Range northward to the Arctic coast, and those strong gusty winds up to 60 miles an hour through the passes of the Alaska Range, and also some pretty gusty winds here south central Alaska areas through the mountain passes of both the Alaska and Chugach Mountains. And for the day on Thursday, still pretty breezy here for areas of south central Alaska, especially through the mountain passes there. Copper River Basin looking at gusty south winds. Winds diminishing though for the eastern Alaska Range. And chance of rain, northern Panhandle, chance of showers down to the south. Rain continues for Kodiak Island, and showers for the Alaska Peninsula, western areas all the way up to the western Arctic coast. And for the coastal water forecasts, we've got southeast winds tomorrow for Wednesday at 20 knots, small craft advisories for the central coast, east 25 to 30 knots, and the extreme north coast up there, gale warnings, east winds 45 knots, seas just under 20 feet. Different story on the inside waters, light winds out of the north at 10 knots for both Lynn Canal, Glacier Bay, and Stevens Passage. Southeast at 10 for Clarence Strait. Then those winds pick up a little bit on Thursday with small craft advisories to Stevens Passage and Lynn Canal for southeast winds at 25 knots, south at 20 for Clarence Strait. South coast looking at southerlies 15 to 20 knots, and small craft advisories for the central coast, south-southeast at 25 with higher gusts, and east-southeast winds at 25 to 30 knots for the north coast. Prince William Sound still going for a gale warning tomorrow for east winds 35 knots, seas 9 feet. Good gales all along the North Gulf Coast, out of the east at 35 to 45 knots, and the Barren Islands about the same thing, east winds 35 knots. And now a gale warning in southern Cook Inlet for northeast winds at 35 knots. North of the Foreland Zone, northeast at 30 knots. East winds 40 knots for Kamishak Bay with 13-foot seas. And for the day Thursday, Cook Inlet, north to northeasterlies at 25 knots. Northeast at 20 knots for Kamishak Bay. Barren Islands, southeast at 20 knots. And for Prince William Sound, down under gales, but still a pretty stiff east wind at 30 knots with 7-foot seas. And the North Gulf Coast, small craft advisories for southeast winds 25 to 30 knots. Kodiak Island, east-northeast winds tomorrow at 30 knots with lighter winds in Bristol Bay out of the east at 15. The Alaska Peninsula, south to southwest winds 10 to 20 knots. And then for Thursday, the Alaska Peninsula here, looking at west winds 15 to 25 knots. Southwest 15 for Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, west-southwesterlies at 20 knots. Eastern Aleutians, west winds 20 to 25 knots. Same thing for Adak and Atka, westerlies at 20 to 25 knots. And the Western Aleutians, west-southwest winds 25 knots. And then for Thursday, Western Aleutians, west-southwest winds 20 to 25, and the Central Aleutians, Adak and Atka, as well as Unalaska Island, Nikolsky, looking at west winds 25 to 30 knots with seas running 7 to 10 feet. And for the southwest coast, east to southeast winds 20 to 25 knots. Small craft advisories of St. Lawrence Island, east at 25 and southeast 25 for Norton Sound. Pribilof Islands, west winds at 20 knots with seas at 7 feet, and St. Matthew Island, southeasterlies at 20 knots. For Thursday, Norton Sound, east winds at 20 knots, St. Lawrence Island and the Yukon Delta coast, northeasterlies at 10, and northwest 25-knot winds for St. Matthew Island as well as the Pribilofs. And for the Kuskokwim Delta coast, winds out of the west at 15 knots, seas down to 4 feet. Up along the, for the Chukchi Sea here, we're looking at small craft advisories to gale force winds out of the south and southeast, 25 to 35 knots with seas 6 to 8 feet. Small craft advisories for the western Arctic coast, south at 25, seas 5 feet, and south winds 20 knots here for the central and east side at about 20 knots with seas running 4 feet. Then for the day on Thursday, for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, winds mostly east at 10 to 15 knots, seas 2 to 3 feet, east of 15 for the central coast. And the west side here, easterlies 10 knots in the Chukchi Sea, east winds at 15 knots.